Thank you for joining us for the second episode of EcoVisionaries podcast, the podcast where we interview the champions, leaders, inventors, and change agents who are shaping the future of sustainability in business. Today's guest is Taj Eldridge, a pioneer climate investor and thought leader with over 25 years of experience spanning finance, energy, and the circular economy. Taj currently serves as the managing director of climate innovations at Johns for the Future, JFF, where he leads initiatives to address the impact of climate on workers and learners, including the multi-million-dollar CREST initiative. He is the general partner at Include Venture Partners, a venture capital fund dedicated to supporting funds led by women and people of color. Taj has made a profound impact on the clean tech industry, previously holding a role as the Senior Director of Investments at the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, LACI, where he established innovative funding mechanisms to drive diversity and sustainability. His work extends beyond finance. Taj is deeply committed to blending climate action with the arts and entertainment, fostering inclusivity and empowering the next generation of climate leaders. With his unique background that includes everything from economic analysis to founding and advising numerous startups, Todd brings a wealth of knowledge and fresh perspective to the ongoing conversation about climate change and sustainability. We're thrilled to have you here today to discuss his journey, insights, and transformative power of climate action.
Yeah, Jamil, thank you, man. I appreciate it. It's interesting hearing the background. It's like life is flashing before my eyes, man. So I appreciate that, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with your audience. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I have to say that when doing my research on you, I was quite impressed with the vast experience that you have acquired spanning all these multiple sectors. If I was to read your resume, I'd be like, how did this guy make these transitions? So you could give me a little background where you actually started. I know finance and how you kind of came into the sustainability.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I grew up in Dallas, and I often say my parents were rich in love but not rich in finances. And so, for me, when I think about the careers that were either in the medical field as doctors, as lawyers, and so forth, but I grew up with a love of music, a sincere love of music. I was born, I say, within the hip hop generation. So for me, it was about how can I take this new creative art form that becomes a part of our lives? It impacts everything that we do, from commercials to influence what we buy, how we live, how we dress, and so forth. So I wanted to be a musician. I wanted to be a rapper growing up, but my parents said there's no such thing as rapper jobs, and so I ended up going to college, and I said I'll show you, and I studied literature and poetry, thinking that that would help me because I once heard that Boogie Down Productions say he's a poet, so let me do that. And so ended up working in the banking industry though after that, and realized that there's a continuation. There's this connection between what I studied in literature and poetry to finance. Sometimes we
Mm-hmm.
often hear this idea that we buy based on emotions, but what we really are saying, we buy based on stories. Stories impact us. Stories from a standpoint of our families to the nations that we have. There's stories about how our nations are built, and so there's stories that connect us to products, even financial products. So, spending the first half of my career as a banker, both from a consumer standpoint to the corporate standpoint, and then going into UBS, and those instances really kind of give me an idea of that portion of finance. And it's from
Right.
there, post UBS, where I found an opportunity to look at the idea of how does startups occur? How do you focus on angel investments? And so that was a really great transition for me because it was all about the things that I love. One of the things
Mm-hmm.
I focused on was fashion. It was a company that was built around fashion. Another thing was about music and wine. And so everything was interrelated to my passions first. They get me to this entry into different areas. That eventually got me into venture capital as well, from the fashion standpoint, focusing on climate. So for me, when I think about these ideas, and I think it influenced the work I do today, a lot of times people think success or pathways and careers are very linear, but they're not. Like life, they are twists and turns. And a lot of times we have to appreciate those twists and turns and realize that we often say culture, and we think culture is the things that we get from home, but
Mm-hmm.
cultures are the things that we learn even from the work that we do as well.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So you kind of transitioned from finance to fashion and entertainment, which was really your first love, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. The My partner at the time, I was COO of the company. I met him when I was at UBS, and he was a very tall brother. He since passed away just recently. So, you know,
Wow.
RIP to War Air Boswell. Definitely great human being. And I met him at UBS, and he was delivering clothing. And 6'8" gentleman. I used to work with a lot of basketball clients. I initially thought he was a basketball player, but
Mm,
I was like remembered him because he was impeccably dressed. And years later, I met him, and he was still doing a lot of custom clothing for a lot of entertainers, such as LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, Kanye West, and then a number of others. And we got together to devise this brand, create this brand that was more so ready to wear. And I was excited because all through my career, I love the idea of fashion because I think about it as, again, emotion. A lot of things we buy in clothes and fashion is based on emotion, whether you're man or woman. But it was during that time was when I started seeing that there was a lot of waste in it, from the production of how we were doing it, from the fact that I used to see people who won't go named, they would buy a piece of article of clothing and wear it once and never discard of it. And so it was
right.
just this occurrence of waste I started seeing that made me start thinking about fashion in a whole different way that really opened
Hmm.
my eyes to sustainability and climate.
Wow. Okay. So a natural progression. You just kind of had a eureka moment where you were like, this is crazy. Could you give me some specific examples of like waste that you saw in the fashion industry or maybe wine?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the clothes we're both wearing, hoodies and t-shirts made of cotton. There's a huge amount of water that comes to making these products that we have on our bodies. And so that's one of the things. The other thing about it as well is that if you look at yourself or myself or anybody else, you ask them, well, how many hoodies do you have? How many t-shirts do you have? And we have
Right.
so many of them, and you multiply that, there's a huge amount of waste that we don't use. And so I see a lot of that from a water usage standpoint on it. And then the other side of that from a usage standpoint is discarding a product. A lot of times we've gone to this idea of, oh, we don't want anything anymore. We just send it to our local, thrift store or what have you. And then we fail to realize that they're inundated with this. And we start seeing a lot of this waste product on the continent of Africa that we're seeing
Yeah.
in the western part of Africa that goes there as well, where so much and it washes up upon shore. And it's just this waste of it too that I think about that comes into the area. And so now, years later, I see a lot of solutions where we're seeing things like the hat that I'm wearing for your artists may see is a hat that's made out of waste with old roses and belly beads and bandanas you'll see on it as well. That normally would go
Wow.
into the trash. You see companies that they're making shoes out of water bottles as a way to reduce a lot of the waste. And so I think for me, it was one of the most visual ideas of the impacts of climate that was for me. Because I'll be frank, growing up when I was younger, I would see the idea of you said the word environmentalist. That person
Mm,
would not look like you or I. It would look like a person who was not you or I. And those
yeah.
some words would come to mind that are not savory, like a tree hugger or all these other things. And I
Yeah.
never thought about it in the context of my culture or where I grew up. But
You're
the
right.
unfortunate part about it is climate impacts us as people of color way more than other communities in different areas, not just in the United States, but globally. And so,
Right.
I think that that's one of the reasons that I start seeing how can we really impact this area and how can
Mm,
we really focus on it. But yeah, fashion was my gateway drug into really understanding the impacts of climate beyond just how we use energy, how we use all of our resources as well.
great. I find that very interesting because I think that everybody who's in sustainability, there's a moment where they can remember where they were like, wait a minute, like there's got to be a better way. And
Yeah.
so I like to connect with people to figure out what that moment was for them because, like I said, we all have it, and I think that it's beautiful because everybody comes to it a different way. But
Yeah.
when you come to it together.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there are moments like when you're driving the car, that initial moment where you first get off the gas and get on the gas and you're driving, and then there's another moment when you begin to coast and it becomes a little bit more clear in your path that you're doing. And I think it's the same way on the career transition or trajectory for me. And even for me,
Yeah.
when I first kind of got into this space, some years later, I got sick with this kidney disease that we later
Mm,
found out was focused was caused by environmental factors where I grew up, because some of my other relatives passed away from it. And that was another catalyst that boosted me into it. And I've told the story many times before about it. But the other half of the story that I think people rarely hear, because I haven't been able to talk about it as much now, is that, people learning me being sick in 2028, but 2023, I had a transplant. So now I'm healthy. Now I'm in the other half of it. And I look at that
Yeah.
to me as a kind of a vision of how the world can be from a climate standpoint. We know the impacts of climate. We know that we hear this all the time about the impacts of climate, but we rarely hear about the joys, the opportunities. And it's the same with me. We often hear about people who are sick. We often hear about people going through these things, but we also need to hear about the other half of it, the other side of it, where people have been
Right.
healed. And I think there's an opportunity to not only heal our world and our nation, but also heal the opportunities for people to get into jobs of the future that are in this climate space, regardless of the political affiliation. This is a global issue, and I
Right.
think the one of the only benefits of COVID is it made us really realize that the world is much smaller than what we actually see and that we can feel, because we're all tied together with this thing in front of us, with you and I, where we're miles apart and having this conversation.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it, uh, it's very interesting when people start to see firsthand, not through words, not through the news, but to actually experience things that connect us all, whether, like you said, no matter where you are in the world. So, um, I think since we're talking about COVID, I know that I've done a little bit of research, but one of the things that I've seen in terms of what you're interested in is public health issues, and
Hmm.
I think this kind of ties into that because public health is actually also an economic issue, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And social justice. So, how would you arrive at those three things? Those are the three main focuses you have, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, a lot of times we hear these phrases, health is wealth. And to your point, we hear these things, but sometimes we fail to really feel them or internalize them. And I think with COVID, that made a lot of the business community realize that health is extremely important. If you don't have a healthy workforce, you're going to have work that stalls. You're going to have things that are going to have and help and reduce your ability to scale. And so, I think that one of the things about the investments that we make in the climate space is that it's more than just about a return on a financial return, but it's also a human return. And I think
Right.
that that's where the public health piece comes into it, because it's interesting too. The American Medical Association has already determined that climate is a major health issue based upon a lot of things that are looking at it. And then when we think about things, even things such as extreme heat, which is a thing we see often within climate change, that has
Right.
that has impacted over 200 trillion hours, work hours globally, of people who are impacted by heat, whether displaced from it, whether there's inability to work. And so, for me, this is when we think about invention, we think about invest, we think about where are problems we can provide solutions to. Well, there's a global problem that there's opportunities to provide solutions to as well.
Absolutely. So I wondered, what do you feel is the best way to address these issues? Because I mean, like you said, the World Health Organization has finally, you know, addressed that climate change is a factor. But are they actually putting forth suggestions or solutions, or is it just a recognition?
Yeah, I think we're in a position now where there's this old phrase that I've heard often that says many hands make light work. And what that means is that together we can go further, of course, than separate. And I think in the climate space, we've seen that. We're seeing a lot more of that now. I often use
Hmm.
this term climate actionist, and as opposed to climate activist. And a lot of times people see that as an either or, but I see that as an and. Because in my
Yeah.
mind, when I think about climate activists rather, they're the ones pushing a lot of the policies, a lot of the political aspects of it. And we've seen how public policy, even in our country, has pushed forward investment in the climate space. Whether we're talking about the CHIPS Act, whether we're talking about the Infrastructure Act, and all these other areas. So there's an area where climate activists have really kind of pushed the needle forward. When I think about
Hmm.
climate activists, I really think about them as entrepreneurs in the finance community that are funding the entrepreneurs. And then actionists sees the opportunities in the policy and creates solutions for that. So both of these groups kind of coming together. And I think now we're in a standpoint to where it is an amalgamation of these things: the climate actionist, and then also media. Media is
Right.
becoming in the center. There was this movie that came out on Netflix that President Obama had produced. That was just come from this book called "Leave the World Behind," and they showcased this idea where the audience saw it, where it was like, what would happen if your access to computers and telephones and everything kind of went haywire. And
Right.
it scared the heck out of me because I'm like, this is reality. And less
Yeah.
than a later, what happened if people remember when we had all these issues with the planes and all planes in the US were down.
Right.
And it's a perfect example of these things coming to light. So I think that for me, the climate actionists, the climate activists, media, the storytellers, all these things are in this space right now in this time for climate. That's putting it front and center, and that's allowing for opportunities coming to this space.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's what scares me the most is, the werewolf movies and the slasher films. Those are cool, but things that can actually happen, that's the real fear.
Yeah, absolutely, no, definitely. And from a standpoint of the art piece of it, there's an organization that I'm proud to be on the board member of called Clean Energy Culture. That's clean with a K and culture with a K. And when my parents were young, before I was even around, there was this song called "Mercy Mercy Me" by Marvin Gaye, where he talks about a lot of the issues that were happening in the world at the time, from war to also climate. And
Right.
our generation, we have the same thing. Childish Gambino, Donald Glover came out with "Feels Like Summer," and it was
Yeah.
jamming. People
Yeah.
may have missed the things he was saying in the lyrics because he's talking about the lack of resources and the things that are happening with our water uses and everything else and waste. And at the end of the
Yeah.
day, when you think about climate in all of its facets, with the sustainability and everything else, it is about how do we utilize resources? How do we
Right.
utilize our resources? And so I think again, what I love is this amalgamation of actionists, activists, and media that's coming to the space.
So speaking of that synergy between there, how most people may not know, but I'm gonna put you on blast for a second. You have a rap album out there, right?
I mean, how do you find that out? But
A little digging.
yeah, I mentioned, when I was younger, 16, 17, went to college in the 17, but I ended up getting signed actually. And I mean, my cousin put out some albums. I made sure to scrub it so you won't be able to find it on the internet because I was young at the time. But it's interesting for me that that's what started my love affair with music. And I think that there's so much power in music. We just talked about two different artists that have done some things. And even now, we look at our own right now in 2024, when we look at our political atmosphere here, there's artists that are saying, you can't use my song, person on this political
Yeah.
side, you can't use my song. So there's power in the arts and the music that we
Yeah.
see. And for me, I learned it very early when I was 16 years old. My mom dropping me off at the studio because I couldn't drive at the time, but I didn't have my license, and recording it. And I think if I can, as a person nearing 50, if I can talk to my 16-year-old self, I definitely probably would speak about different things than what I was speaking about during that time. But I definitely would tell that person that continue your love for music because it's important when you have these conversations with people and then with community.
Yes. Actually went to high school with Donald, so I was very happy to see his trajectory of success. Like he's uh, extremely talented in all ways, acting,
Yeah,
music, dance, everything. So he
yeah,
went to a performing arts high school, and to see him where he's at now, I love to see it. Man. I love to see our people winning, and not just winning, but leaving a positive impact. Like his music, everything just has good energy and good vibes to it. So
yeah. And I think the great thing about one of the things I always think about is that a lot of times people may believe that they're powerless because they may not be like a Donald Glover who have all these people eyes on them. But one of the things I always say is that if there's just one eye on you, you have influence. It doesn't matter the quantity; it matters the quality. So there's a bit of power in the things that we do as people, and I think that goes back to the climate aspect of it. Is that a lot of times people may feel like, oh, I have to do like even the things I talked about what we're wearing. People might feel like, oh, I have to contribute to what I buy, what I consume, everything else from a climate standpoint. But it's
right,
everything. I mean, the laws have said that organizations are people are living organisms as well, and so organizations have to really kind of go through that also. But again, what I say from the very beginning, that stories tell. So when people talk about the stories that they're involved in, when they talk about where they're from, when I talk about
Mhm.
people who may live in Cancer Alley, or people who may live in Flint, Michigan, in the water issue, or Jackson, Mississippi, that gives people an
Right.
opportunity to say, well, why is that? Well, why do you have this? And let me learn more. And I
Mhm.
think now, when I was growing up, it was we didn't. It was I remember first kind of getting on the internet, first having access to the internet back then, and it was about access to information. And I think now it's about not about access, but it's about what is the right information, because there's so much misinformation that's out there. And so
Absolutely.
again, that's why it's important where that one person is influencing somebody else can be very important in the space, whether you're a venture, startup, or what have you.
Definitely. Yes. The each one teach one is a time, an age rule that I think gets overlooked a lot these days, but should be
Absolutely.
focused on. So you mentioned in some previous interviews that I've come across the term economic art. Uh, what does this concept mean to you? And could you elaborate on maybe entrepreneurs and artists can relate this to their work and their journey?
Oh, absolutely. And I full. There's this quote that says that's from this film producer that says, thievery is not nothing wrong. Art is thievery. Steal when you can. And I definitely stole this idea from a brother who's been in this space, who runs this firm called Authentic Ventures here in LA. And one of the things he said, he talked about this idea of the hip hop mixtape. And one of the things what he
Mhm.
talked about is this idea that founders are like artists. Artists create these albums. You think about people like Biggie, or even we talk about Donald Glover, and created these albums and everything else, and these sonic experiences and videos that people consume.
Right.
Similarly, founders create things, whether they're products or services, that businesses or people consume. When Donald Glover put those albums out, he had a label with him. That label helped finance and make people aware of that. Similarly, venture capital funds help founders put out their products and or their services, and make their stakeholders in the media aware of those things. So there's to me a good relationship between the artist and the founder. And then I think lastly, when I think about incubators and accelerators, they're to me are like DSPs. They're like the Spotify's or the SoundClouds, and they make people in the audience aware of the musicians, and the accelerators and incubators make people aware of the founders. And so for me, founders, investors, everybody are artists. We all are
Mhm.
artists involved in this art. And the reason I think about me as an economic artist is because my hands are in many different things. I often say I wear many hats, both literally and figuratively. And so my hands are in the investment space with investing in funds and founders. My hands are in the workforce space, ensuring that we have these communities and these learning opportunities and pathways to get into these green jobs. And so what I look at for me is not just building, having a return on an investment and saying, yes, I'm building generational wealth. What I'm looking for to build is ancestral wealth and ancestral returns that will last long after you and I are gone.
Oh, yes. Sounds like the type of path I'm on. Are there any specific examples of, the meshing between arts and entrepreneurship that you've been a part of or that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at things like I mentioned earlier, Clean Energy Culture, which is a nonprofit that was founded about 2 years ago by a good friend by the name of Michael Hawthorne. He was actually a founder when I met him as a founder. He was a founder building a faith-based product, and we got
Mm.
along great. This product was called Halo Loop that he built. But what I didn't realize was that he was with the Obama campaign and focusing on environmental issues at the time before he built this. So he had that background, and then he had the founder background. And so when we start talking, we start both talking about our love of music, and he starts saying about this idea of how can we bring awareness to the climate issue, especially to of color, using a medium that we know, like music. And one of the co-founders is a super producer by the name of Mr. Hankey, who produced songs like Torculator by the City Girls, Good Love with Usher, and so many other things. And so,
Nice.
and I think for me, you have to talk, you have to speak in the language of the people. And when I
Mhm.
say that, you know, I mentioned some of the artists I like that came up with me, from Rakim to KRS One, all those other things. But the artists of today are people in this other space that people listen to, whether those are Big X the Plug or some of these other areas. And I think the idea of cleaning these cultures really focus on that this idea. How can we create this idea of really getting people to understand what culture means and how it comes into this space? And so, in addition to that, we've also been seeing a lot of musicians such as Pusha T and Drake and others investing in climate-focused companies and realizing
Mhm.
the impact there as well. So I think it's great that we're seeing a lot more of that. I think it's great that I saw the transition where, and I'm a lover of jewelry. The jewelry that I love is jewelry that is that doesn't use carbon. It is lab made, as people say, but I love it because it's sustainable, a more sustainable type of
Yeah.
product. I love now that you're seeing people gift each other electric vehicles in the entertainment space. You're seeing people who are not in the entertainment space talking about giving people LLCs and building from that. So I
Right.
think there's this connection between culture, music, entrepreneurship, wealth generation, and impact that we're all seeing that's coming from the community that's in the space.
What do you think is driving that synergy? Like where, because I think before people didn't look at climate tech or climate change that as profitable, much less something that they would want to be involved in. So what's really driving that
Yeah,
change?
yeah, Jamil. I think when I first got into climate tech or clean tech, as we called it back then, I often joke is that I remember it was a dirty word back then. Clean tech was a dirty word because you had the
Yeah,
failure of syndrome, you have all these other things that would happen at the time, and a lot of investors lost a lot of money in that space. I
yeah,
think a few things have occurred since that time. I think, we start seeing the rise of venture capital in the space with post COVID, because I think people start seeing this global impact of things that are happening, and climate, we always say, is definitely global. I think also too, shout out to Generation Z. I think they and millennials as well. I think those two generations have put a lot of things in the forefront, whether it's about well-being in the workforce, whether it's about sustainability, whether it's about those spaces. And I think, just like so many different generations, I'm Generation X and the baby boomer generation and the generation before us kind of brought those things in with them. I think now it's with this new generation bringing these things in with them as well. And it's interesting for me too, because I think that the idea of entrepreneurship is like rampant, and that's a good thing, especially in Black and Brown communities. I mean, in Atlanta, they just had Invest Fest recently, and I think that's really great. But even you look at things from a minute level, like there's this show that people may know. I'm sadly addicted to it, called Find Love or Balloon, and people are popping these balloons and everything is a dating game. But for me, as the economist, when I look at it even deeper, I notice that every time I hear people on this show, when they're describing their work that they do, it's multiple. It's not just I work at X. It is I
yeah,
do this, do this, I do this, I do this. And I and I,
yeah,
and I think back in the day we used to call it, side hustles. And I think now it's not necessarily side hustles. It is I'm doing what I enjoy. I'm doing
yeah,
things that bring joy. And I think that's the same thing happening in the sustainability space, is that people are saying not only is this an issue that we need to figure out, because once you guys are gone, we have to stay here with it. But they're also
yeah,
saying, well, how do I do that with joy? How do I do that with jobs I want to do and things I want to careers I want to see in this pathway? And if there are not any things there, how do I find a way to make one?
yes, yes. I think that that's a good thing for the next generation because we've always thought about, like you said, side hustles, and our parents, they work for a company for 25, 30 years and retire, and just sadly that's just not the case anymore. So finding ways that you can provide for your family and succeed while doing something that you actually enjoy is it's a hard path to find, but when you find it, I think that it's a beautiful thing for people to capitalize on it and
Yeah,
work together.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that, to that point, even when we're working workforce, I think that employers are going to have to realize that generations are changing. I mean, right now we're in a situation where you have some companies where you have boomers, some boomers who still kind of work and still kind of working.
Mhm.
Generation X, multiple generations working together. My generation, Gen Z, some millennials, all working in the same spaces, and each of us have different aspects where we bring it to the work we're doing. And I think that's cool. That's great because people can learn from each other. You never stop learning until you leave this earth. And I think that as employers, we're going to have to see that how can we create opportunities where we take advantage of these shifts in generation and these shifts in culture, to build these companies and to make people feel like they're whole at the things we do. I often think about how Gmail was created at Google, and the story goes that Google would give their employees, some employees, some time to tinker, sometimes to give back and to kind of think of some things. And had that not occurred, we wouldn't have some of these products that we have today from Google. And I think what
Right.
if companies think about that as well? Even at Jobs for the Future, one of the things that Jobs for the Future does is really interesting that we implemented with my team is that every Friday in August, it's time off. People don't work on Fridays, and so that gives
Mm,
people time to kind of do things. And I think some people create, some people like me, you and I on this podcast talking, but I
right.
think it gives opportunity for things that can grow from that. And I think that's what I get excited about, and that's what a true artist does too. Is they find the little things and they be able to branch out and do other things with it. We just talked about Donald Glover, started out as
Yeah.
acting, now he's doing
Yep.
music, doing film, and just think if what if he would just segment it to just that one type of creative. And so the same thing with other humans as well. We're all our own child is going to be on ourselves.
Absolutely. Yes. I think being able to tap into that and being encouraged, especially by leadership, like some a boss at your company, would be advantageous for everybody who's around because as we grow individually, we grow as a group.
Yeah, yeah. And I think at the end of the day, what I love about this new era that we're in is that everybody's, I think, focusing on impact. We're realizing that impact is key, and there are things that impact our impactness. And what I mean
Mhm.
by that is that when COVID occurred, it didn't matter how much money a company was making. It didn't none of that mattered. Everything came to a halt. Everything
Yeah.
came to a halt. So the problem had to be fixed in order for you to
Mhm.
make a return. So the same thing is
Right.
on climate. That in order for us to, if you're really into this company, you're really a company, you're making widgets or whatever you're making, all that can come to a halt because of some calamity. And so
Mhm.
there's a responsibility for the business community, similar to the people in this world, to make sure we try to at least find some solutions. And again, that's where those actions come in at, and I get excited about
Right.
those solutions. And while there's a need for capitalists and venture capitalists to come in this space who actually take risk in these
Right.
ideas.
Completely. Um, One of the underlying tones that I think I get from you is that inclusivity is one of your main focuses. I mean, it's not just about your community or their communities. You seem to be wanting to reach across the aisle, as they say, and include everyone from all walks of life.
Yeah.
Um, are there any personal experiences that you have that kind of brought you to that or garnered that feeling within you, or is it just something you've grown to?
Yeah, no, I think that one of the things that we often hear this idea about diversity when we hear this, and sometimes people, there's some people who say, DEI, all this sort of stuff, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a bad thing. When I think of diversity, I think of more than just race and gender, sexual orientation, others. I think those things bring what their real value is. Those things bring a different way of looking at things.
Right.
You know, all of us are human. When we think about it, the Black community is not a monolith. We're not. There's a lot of different nuances in the Black community. The same thing in the Latino community. Same thing in the Jewish community. Same thing in the Muslim community. Same thing in the Christian community. And I think that we have to live, at least in this country, we have to live up to this idea of out of many one that this country is founded on. And I think it gives us an opportunity to do so. And there's several data. We've seen a lot of data that's been coming out a lot of studies that talk about the diversity of a team leads to better results and everything else like that. So we know the science is behind that. But I just think
Right.
from a standpoint of getting to know people is important. Remember, I mentioned I was a poetry major and a literature major, and one thing I loved about literature is that it had these characters. There was all these characters in it, and these characters were all different. And I think
Right.
that's what the human race is. I get excited to meet people because everybody has these different stories and these backgrounds to them, and I think
Mhm.
those are the things that bind us and tie us because we begin to see that there's more connections to us than differences. So I think inclusion is really important for all communities because it allows us to learn, it allows us to grow, and then sometimes it allows us to scale.
Yes. Are there any specific examples that you could reference, or maybe just kind of give the our listeners, viewers, an idea of different cases or case studies where the community and the corporations come together to partner for what ends up being better for everyone?
Yeah, I think of when I think of from a climate standpoint. Of course, when people hear those stories, they think about companies that you hear often in this space, like Patagonia, that does a
Mhm.
lot of work in the community and that does a lot of work in ensuring that not only the people who wear their product, but the people who build their product are focused on sustainable routes. You hear about companies like Kind Snacks, which is now bought by Mondelez, and you hear about their work with their farmers who help them, cultivate the beans and everything else they work with. So I think that there's been a lot of companies in this space that have been doing those connections with communities, that have been realizing ways to do it. And I think now more traditional companies are realizing the value of that, because it also creates brand loyalty. You
Mhm.
see a lot of community, a lot of people that navigate to certain brands, and also too the story of how they make their brands so important. There's a shoe company that I'm involved in called Alice Gray, ALESGRAY.com, and they're a shoe company that focus on building these sustainable shoes. I've already talked about the idea of fashion and how not only do we have waste in the production of the product, but also the waste. How do we get rid of these products? And this is a shoe that's
Right.
actually biodegradable. So it goes back into the soil after use of it gets discarded. And that's phenomenal. And it's great. But the other part about that is that this shoe is also really dedicated and made for a lot of frontline workers. So think about your hotel cleaning people, the people who work in the fast food industry, and all those things. So I say all that to say that I think that you're seeing a lot of companies come to communities and get involved in communities just from a sustainability standpoint through startup companies, because this company is a startup. And those
Right.
startups are being the conduits between the larger Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 companies and the connection into customers. And then there's a policy piece of that too, because when we think about ideas like Scope 3 that looks at our supply chain, that's been a part
Right.
of it as well. And so I think that there's so many different examples of direct to community involvement with companies, to indirect with companies that have these suppliers who's been in this space, to policies that kind of think about people there, to even the way that consumers react with their wallets and think about, I want this type of company versus others, in the sustainability space, in the climate space. So I think we'll see more. And I think the other thing about it too, just like how we talked about Leave the World Behind and some of these other movies, I think you're going to see other forms of entertainment that come out there that educate people and bring more awareness to it. Because one of the
Right.
other things I'll say too, Jamil, is that those of us in the space, in the climate sustainability space, we have to be wary of operating in the vacuum, in a silo, and only talking to people who believe in the things that we believe in. Sometimes you have
Yes.
to talk to people who don't believe in the things you believe in, so you can understand how they're coming to it, how they feel about it, and maybe look at it from a whole different standpoint. And I often say this is that historically in the past, I believe, and again for me, I believe that there's been a villainizing people who may work in the oil and gas industry, the coal industry, villainizing them. You can't villainize a person who's working to provide for their family. That's in their space, and I think that's where the actions comes in and says, all right, well, your family worked in the coal industry, you work in the oil and gas industry. Let me think. Here's some other job opportunities in the space. As a matter of fact, I'm moving my company to West Virginia. I'm moving my company to Houston, and then there's a organization of schools that help you create pathways to get these kids to work in this. So now your next generation of family can work in the alternative investment industry. So I think that while there's a need to quickly reduce a lot of the exposure to greenhouse gas emissions in order to definitely save our world, the thing we have to
Mhm.
always think, this is not a one time thing. This is a behavioral change that we have to do. So I'm looking at both at the short term of it as well as the long term. Again, going back to this idea of ancestral returns that we have to think about, especially when we're talking about climate and sustainability.
Yeah, I think education and awareness are increasing here in the states, and that's kind of what's driving this climate action. I'm living between Japan and the United States right now. Right? I mean, just the level of education that they have surrounding the climate and the environment. And, I mean, from the time that they're in pre-K, they're learning about their connection to the environment, how they can, the little things that they do on a daily basis impact not just their community, but the world at large. And when they grow up, like society is just so much, it has so much respect for the planet and for the environment and for each other. Like their
Yeah,
respect for each other crazy
yeah,
compared to what we do.
yeah. And I think that's another example of inclusion. I think you and I were talking as you were in out of the country in Japan. I was mentioning I'm en route to go to Taiwan to speak in Taipei at the APEC conference, Asia Pacific Economic Conference. And one of the things we often talk about is, again, climate is global, sustainability is global. So there are things that they're learning from the way we do things around career preparedness in the green skill space. And there's things that we'll bring out to the United States that they're doing in that space that we're learning from as well. And I think, again, that's what the whole idea of, I think in the United States, we often think about diversity and inclusion solely within our borders. But when I think about inclusion, I think about the idea of there's these other countries that are out there that are looking at ways of doing things differently that we have to keep an eye on. And I think that's why it's so great. Again, going back to the greatest of this generation is that even the idea of digital nomads, I'm so excited about, because they're giving people an opportunity, especially if they can engage in the community, to go to other communities and bring back things and workings and ways of dealing and ways of working as well, which I think is so phenomenal.
Gotcha. We'll edit this part out. Hold on a second. What were you saying? That's fine. Yeah. I don't know how to do all that. You're expert. Yep. Okay. I can't hear anything now. No. No, I can't hear myself either. Can you talk? Say something, Taj.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I can hear you. Oh,
yeah.
All right. Okay. So we just put back up right there. So as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just being, what I think of here in the United States is this egg that we're in and nobody else is involved. I find that it's kind of hard to change people once they're adults. So, my focus right now is my mother is a retired PhD educator, and we're working on educational materials that we can take to the youth. Like my daughters, they are all about sustainability. They teach their teachers about plastics recycling, and they've done videos that they share with the school, stuff like that. They're very excited about it. They're eager to learn that connection between themselves, the planet, and the people who are around it. And that excitement really makes me enthusiastic about the prospect of being able to, have that effect on the young generation, which will, like you say, eventually inherit this world that we're building right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. But the only thing I would say though, and we talk about, it's interesting in this country, we've had this whole conversation about ageism with this election that we just had. And one thing I would say too is that, again, I think I mentioned earlier is that I think that while when you're young, there is an opportunity to mold the education because you're consuming so much things in it, right? So there's a greater opportunity. But I do think also as people get older, there may be catalysts that change the way we talk. We just talked about a catalyst for me, whether it's fashion or my illness. And I think as people get older, perhaps there will be catalysts that will change the ideas. And also this is community. In California, Palm Springs, there was this accelerator that focused on founders over the age of 55. And again, we talk about culture, we talk about community. That's a community. And it's interesting, if a person comes up to me and they're talking about music and they're saying something that doesn't really jive, they're like, yeah, X number made this album. I'm like, wait a minute, you're not in this community. And it's the same thing within the community of people from an age standpoint. People who are
Yeah.
around the same age may have this connection that those of us may not have, and so they might be the conduit to help them people rethink things. And I think that's what I get excited about as well. I mean, it's a reason that the AARP has a venture fund for the
Right.
population.
I did not know that, so that's a good thing for our viewers. If you're, how old you got to be AARP? AARP?
What is it? What is it? I don't know. I'm about to turn 50, and I think they're on my doorstep. But I think 55 when they start reaching out to folks, and then
Oh wow.
but it's interesting, and it's interesting. When I was young, we used to joke and say that when you start getting the AARP cards, sticking all these benefits, and now they've upped their game. They're like benefit is now equity investment. So I love to hear that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that the interest in startups is growing across the entire value chain, no matter what industry you're in. Um, that collaboration is definitely key and needed because for the longest, especially in our community, I mean, you
Yeah.
could speak to this actually more than me. Like, I believe that there's only 1% of venture capital goes to, is it Black and Brown communities? Is that
Yeah.
an accurate
Yeah.
fact?
Yeah. And I mean,
Yeah,
I think for me, it goes back to even to that point about the lack of investment. One of the other data points I saw was that even post George Floyd, the amount now has decreased even further than what it was before George Floyd. And so there's this drop in it. But one of the reasons that my partners and I created Include Ventures back when he did it was we wanted to see more people in the community, women and people of color, as fund owners to be able to make those decisions. Because at the end of the day, I think it's all about the decisions who controls the capital in that
yeah,
space. I did a lot of the climate focused opportunities in that fund. I've since kind of rolled back to from a partner standpoint, from a GP standpoint, to doing a lot more work on the venture partner side with our fund. But the same idea kind of comes to fruition that we need to steadily have different type of capital allocations that are out there to move forward. One of the other things I think too that people fail to think about is that, again, putting my banker's hat on, debt. A lot of times we forget that debt is cheaper than equity. And so sometimes founders always say, I need venture capital, I need venture capital, but maybe you don't need venture capital. Maybe you need some type of lending opportunity. Maybe you need an angel investor. Maybe you need a foundation that can do MRI or PRI investing. I've often
yeah,
said that venture capital, like, when you're building a company, similar to the whole, when we talk about the hip hop mixtape, but when you're building a company, you're basically taking a person from A to B, from one place to another. The world that it is before your company, your product was created, and the world after. And
right.
different things to their journey: a car, a train, a bus, an airplane.
Mm,
And for me, I think of venture capital as jet fuel. It goes and it's rapid for you to scale. But if you're driving a bus, you're driving a car, you don't need jet fuel. But both of those things, a jet, a plane, a bus, a car, they still go from A to B. So I
right.
think that there needs to be this idea that understanding that there's different type of capital that's out there. There are CDFIs are doing some really great stuff. There are angel investment groups like Republic, and even the African American owned seat at the table that I'm an investor in, that's doing work like equity crowdfunding for companies, and a number of different angel and SPP groups and affinity groups that are out there as
Yeah,
well. So I get excited about that because, again, actionists, those are people who saw an
right.
issue and said, there's not a lot of funding. Instead of complaining about it, let's do something about it.
Definitely. So while we're in this lane, maybe you could give me just some pros and cons for our listeners who are maybe seeking to raise funds right now. What would be some pros and cons between equity and debt?
Yeah, yeah, I think, I think on the equity, both of the things have risk, and I think that's the first thing people need to realize is there is risk in being an entrepreneur. That's why you don't have a lot of people doing it. And it's all
Yeah,
about the appetite for risk. And there are risks on both sides of it. There are risks for you as a founder as you're building because you're sacrificing time because you can't get time right. That's an asset greater than equity and greater than everything else. There's a
yes,
risk for the investor because they're putting their money into this that may not come to fruition. There's no guarantee with it. There's risk on the debt side that they may default. You might not get your money back from a better standpoint.
right,
But I think, on the climate side, we have these opportunities, these ideas where it's about sometimes that you get in two camps, whether you're focused on hardware or you're focusing on software. And sometimes, thankfully, there are companies that are in between. And I
Hmm.
see a lot of opportunities on the hardware side where you can use debt for your assets and really grow in that space. And I think with venture capital and debt, some of the pros are, again, you're building a company, you're being able to build at a pace that you want to
Hmm.
do. You've been able to use capital in a different area. You can use your debt at a different time frame than you do your equity side. And I think that come with anything that you take with any type of fuel from the capital side is that you have to choose your partners wisely. You have to choose the companies that you're dealing with wisely in that space as well. But
Right.
what I would say though, everything depends on the type of company you're building. Every opportunity is different. Every time that you're building something is different, and there's different capital for that. So I would say on that end, as a founder, explore all your options. Talk to other founders that have built some things. Build that community. We just talked about this idea of culture. There's a culture of founders. Similar to if you play professional basketball, you see somebody else who plays professional basketball. You guys have this connection. Whether you're NBA, WNBA, whatever, you know what it took to get you to that space. You know what it's like being in a game. As a founder, you meet another founder, you both know what it's like building. I don't care if that founder is successful or unsuccessful, you built. And so I think a
Right.
lot of the times when you think about these things, think about pros and cons, especially in the area that you're at. Sometimes get out the house and talk to some of these other founders in the space, because again, you're building this culture of founders and this culture of people who are trying to be actionists.
Yeah, definitely. So while we're on that, what type of companies would benefit more from venture versus debt?
Yeah, I think I mentioned before, a lot of companies you're building things with hardware. You have assets to
Mhm.
lend upon. Those are perfect for it. So, for example, one of the companies we made a check into when I was at Lacey, and I actually just left their company because they just launched a Long Beach, so I'm extremely proud. There's a company called Amp Air, and this is a company that builds hybrid electric airplanes in this space. And of course, airplanes are heavy manufacturing companies. A lot of debt is involved in that. So it's a perfect company when you think about the idea of debt. So that's an example because of assets afford. One of the other things of it is even on a smaller scale, there's this other company that I'm an equity advisor in, an equity partner in called Kigit, KIGT, which is a company that makes EVSCs or charging stations. And that's a physical product. And then also it's an opportunity where they're taking those charging stations and combining with restaurants or other areas. And so we're seeing this connection between real estate, this connection between technology, connection between housing. And I think when you think things like that, those are opportunities for debt. But it doesn't have to be those things that are big like that. We've seen companies that are in the consumer space, from the alcoholic beverage space, that are building new
Mhm.
ways to consume a new product and new form factors in the space that's manufacturing piece of it. So I think the key thing too is, for a founder, if you're looking at the opportunities around debt and equity, is keep your eyes open, look what's in your community, and also make sure you're talking to, again, other founders in this space. The reason I keep mentioning that as well is that sometimes you can have a lot more information. If I was a founder and I went to an investor, and the investor gave me all this information, I had now have a wealth of knowledge, right?
Right.
So if you're going to talk to the same investor, it'd be better to talk to the founder that just had that conversation with them, to be prepared, to know what they're
Mhm.
asking about, to even figure out if they fit into your deal, whether it's around debt or whether it's around equity. So I think there's this idea of communities that are important, and you don't have to go to an accelerator or incubator to be a part of community. This is why I always say build communities from within, and why it's important when we talk about inclusion, not just for people, but also for founders and entrepreneurs.
Right. Right. Wow, a lot of insight. I think. What seems like you're passionate about involving youth in entrepreneurship and climate space. What are some of the most promising initiatives you've seen, and how do you think that we can further empower the younger generation to take lead in this movement?
Oh, absolutely. I think for me, my father passed away recently. He used to have this phrase that says, "Bury the man, continue to plan." And what that means is that we're all going to die. I mean, that's the reality of it. That's why I always talk about ancestral returns. But the plan
Absolutely.
of building ancestral returns, the plan of generational wealth, is not just about the generation of your family; it's about the generation of everyone that's here. And I think
Yeah.
that that's the plan that we look at, because a rising tide, I still believe in the whole idea of rising tide lifts all boats. A rising tide creates opportunities for all. And so I
Right.
think that there is a lot of youth that I would love to support. And also I look at it similar to where a frustration for me used to be in our political system, where we would have, now especially if I'm talking about the Black community, definitely, is that we don't have a succession plan. We don't have,
Right.
a lot of times some of our leaders, they pass away, because all of us pass away, and there's no one in that they have trained to come up after them to continue the plan, right? Bury the man, continue the plan, man or woman, continue the plan. And so I think about the same thing even in this space in climate. And I've been really blessed to create organizations like Green Tech Noir, which we have a lot of young people in this space. Is a group of investors, founders all over the diaspora, over 500 members in this organization. But we all try to encourage each other and make sure that people have access to job opportunities, to champion what each other's do. And then I think also for me, what I often try to do is, I get a chance to go on a lot of podcasts and get to speak. I often like speaking on new podcasts like this, because you get asked questions and people find out things that you never really thought about, like, I had an album. But I
Yeah.
think that one of the things I get excited about is when a person asks you to speak, say, okay, I'll speak, but you have to also give an opportunity to this young person who hasn't spoke before, but this is a pace of it. And so there's some really great young people out in the space, again, that are at the intersection of actionists and activists. People like Wawa Gatherer, who built this company called Black Girl Environmentalist. I just had her speak at a national conference for JFF on the main stage. And I'm loving the ways that she looks at from the Gen Z perspective. There's people like
Right.
Diamond Spratling with a Girl Plus Environment out of Atlanta, is doing some really great stuff. Or a guy by the name of Wes Gobar and Simi Cole with Black Oak Collective, who's been doing stuff in this space. And so I think all of us have to do it, because my whole thing is modeling. So my hope is that the same way I reached out to them and pulled them up for me, and one day if
Yeah.
they're lucky enough to be in my position and as old as me, and they in turn will reach out to Generation Alpha and the generations after them to bring them up
Right.
as well. We need a nation of million, as Chuck used to say, so it won't get held back.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any specific projects that you're aware of here in the States that kind of give you, you're excited about, or you know, when it
Yeah,
pertains specifically to the youth?
yeah, I'm excited about the project that my team and I lead at JFF. It's called Crest. It was funded by the Aries Charitable Foundation, and CREST stands for Climate Resilient Employees for Sustainable Tomorrow. And what we're doing in the program, amongst many other things, where we're talking about the idea that every job has an opportunity to be a climate job or a green job. We're focused on entrepreneurship. What I love about CREST is that it's looking at the diversity of this nation. Like, I'm in the West Coast, a lot of people in the East Coast, and there are people who live in all parts of the states in this country. And so they also need opportunities and pathways into green jobs. But what I get
Right.
excited about is that this gives them an opportunity to look at programs that are out there, whether you're in New Orleans, whether you're in Pittsburgh, or you're in Knoxville, Tennessee, or some of the other places, that you don't have to move to another place to do it, to get a job in a space that you can live in your community. And I think that's important, for me, because I think that that's culture. And I think that those are important. So Crest is one I'm very excited about that we've done. But there's others, and I mentioned some of those organizations like Girl Plus Environment, Black Girl Environmentalist, Black Oak Collective, Work on Climate, and so many others that really kind of focus on a lot of the next population. One other program I'm really excited about is this program called This is Planet Ed. You mentioned, I believe your mother's in the education field. My wife is in the education field. And what I love about This is Planet Ed is that it creates opportunities and tools for educators, teachers in K through 12 and higher education to have the
Right.
conversation with students about climate, and to also tie it back to the standards. Because again, you don't want to create extra work for people when we're talking about these issues, and you want to talk about the opportunities. So I'm excited about that as a way to formalize this excitement that a lot of young people have into what can we do? Because I think the next stage that people say is that, all right, I know there's an issue. We talked about this. Now, what can I do? And I think
Right.
that's what I get excited about, is these pathways that show people what you can do from a career standpoint, from an actionist standpoint as well.
Yeah. And we kind of touched on it earlier, but that's another reason why I've been trying to push this whole image. Honestly, for me in my journey through advanced recycling, my focus was so much on the business side, and I kind of wanted to operate behind the scenes. I didn't want anybody to know what I was doing until I was already doing it. And then those
Yeah.
two, but I feel like now it's important for the youth to see, not just the youth, but our people, our age, everybody who may be disenfranchised or doesn't see themselves represented in this industry. I
Yeah,
think it's important for them to see that you don't have to be Greta or Jane Goodall or a hippie from
yeah,
the '70s. Like, this
yeah,
impacts you and everyone. So,
yeah. I think for me the same way. I think there's two people in the space for me. First, on the venture capital side, there's this gentleman named Reginald F. Lewis. He was an investor. It was my first time when I was younger. I didn't even know what venture capital private equity was. All I knew was doctor, lawyer, like I mentioned, and football star because I lived in the great land of the Cowboys. But I learned about venture capital by reading his book. He had a book called Why Guys Have All the Fun, and that
love
really
it.
influenced how this is what venture capital. This is interesting. This is about managing money, but not only managing money, make money. You create it. Again, the creative in me is always about. He left behind a legacy. He left behind this idea, and of course the
Yeah,
fashion in too, because he purchased this company called McCall's. All the old school people would know that McCall's is this company that did pattern clothing and pattern dresses. So that was just interesting to me. And then on the climate side, we talk a lot about environmental justice, but the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard, again, a person that when we think about environmentalism, I never heard about him until I started getting into it, and I realized this gentleman created it, and he's still alive today. And so I think that that's why a lot of times too, those of us in this space, we have to also talk about our heroes and talk about the people that got us into this area. Because a lot of people might not even realize that Dr. Bullard is the person that's behind all this idea about environmental justice, and in this space. And so I think it's important to be out, and I think it's a lot. I look at people again with a music standpoint. There's this gentleman who recently passed away named Clarence Avant, who's been in the music industry, and I when I was in my early career, I loved the way he moved because no one knew him really. He was kind of behind the scenes, but he was impactful behind the scenes. He was a giant, and by
yeah,
the time he got older, everybody knew him because he was so impactful. And so for me, I tend to kind of move in that space to where I want to be impactful. I want to be in this space. But unfortunately, when you wear hats all the time, or you have a big beard, you can't be that invisible. So I look at it on both sides of it too.
yeah, yeah. It's like you want to be stealth, but when you called, you gotta stand up.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
you shared a quote from your father: "Bury the man, continue the plan." It's always stuck with you, I'm assuming, since you heard it at a young age.
Yeah,
Yeah. So as a man whose father, my dad always shared quotes with me, and now that I look back on it, it's like there's so much wisdom in such a small quote. And if you can pinpoint the ones that really matter, you can communicate generational wisdom through knowledge. Um, so I wanted to ask, what does this quote mean to you? And are there any other specific pieces of wisdom that your father passed on or that you've come across that you apply in your day to day life?
yeah. I love the way that you said it, where there's simplicity and wisdom, right? There are backwards. There's wisdom and simplicity, and what we mentioned to me, that's poetry. When you talk about bury the man, continue to plan, that's poetry, and that's what I've always taken advantage of and looked at it. And there's other things too. Like I've always heard this quote that came from my estimation, Benjamin E. Mays of find a way or make one. And I've lived my life in the same way of if there's nothing out there, either find or make one. And then there's other quotes that we've heard and others that's come from it. And I think this one even comes from Hannibal, even though some people have taken credit of it, is where talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And so I think these little things allow us to express so much in a very short time. And I think it's even important now because of our ADHD or our lack of attention that we may have, that all of us have, unfortunately, uh,
Yeah,
good or bad. I think it's interesting on it. But I think that particular quote from my father really resonated with me because it told me one thing that all of us will pass away, and I think that is a reality that we all will face. And I think when I was younger, I was very afraid of that because I was afraid of the unknown.
yeah,
But when I hear that quote, what I realize is that what is not unknown is the plan. The plan, if you have it there, it's known, and that will continue long after we're gone. This nation is here. There are people who passed away hundreds of years ago in certain cities in Dallas, where I'm from, and other areas, and Dallas still remains.
right.
So I think for me that talks about this idea, and it goes for me when I think about this idea. of ancestral returns and ancestral investing is that the things we do now, it's like the butterfly effect, will impact things so far down the future that we
Right.
don't know of. I think that's what is exciting to me. And I think that quote from my father really it has emboldened the way that I do my work and
Right.
realize that what I do is not just a 9 to 5. It is a culture. It is a lifestyle. It is something that I live and breathe, like so many others who are in this space. They're living and breathing their truth in what they do.
Absolutely. Yeah, the quote that my dad told me when I was younger that just always stuck with me out of all. I mean, I know a lot of them, but the one that I kind of live my life by is the future is determined by your focus.
Yeah,
And that's all. My focus has always been on bettering, living a happy life, and making sure that I can provide for and
yeah,
beyond my family. So I teach my daughters the quotes that I learned. And I try to instill them all the time, ask them to repeat them back to me, what they think they mean, and you know, it's passing that wisdom down is something that I know has helped me in my life. So I try to pass it not just to them, but to the next generation. So hopefully somebody will watch this interview and come across two quotes they never heard.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think even with that, I'm wearing this TWA shirt, and a lot of people may remember TWA as an old airline, and now it's a hotel in JFK. It's a hotel that's there, and I think
Wow.
about that is even that like the form of the company changed from an airplane to now a hotel, but the
Mm,
energy and experience is still there. If you ever go to the TWA hotel in JFK, you'll see that it's almost like you're traveling back in time. So again, that's another
mm,
example for me about the plan. The plan may change its forms. It may be
mm.
investing at the beginning. It may switch to workforce. It may switch to entertainment. But at the end of the day, for me, the plan is always about how can I make sure our community that's impacted by this issue of climate has opportunities around it. And similar to TWA, it was about this grooviness, this feel when you rode the airplane, and now you're
Right.
in the hotel in your room, you're feeling the same thing.
Nice. I didn't even know that they had transitioned to hotels, but I would definitely check that out.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely tell people if you're ever in JFK in New York, it's literally right in the terminal. Definitely go
Oh
stay
wow.
there. I definitely give it a thumbs up.
Hey, I'll take your recommendation. So you've expressed the desire to collaborate more with government and city officials who share your passion for climate and sustainability. What are some of the key challenges and opportunities you see in fostering these collaborations?
You said with cities?
Government and cities,
Yeah.
municipalities. You know.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. I was blessed to be with two incubators that had city influence. First one was the University of California, where the incubator was partnering with the city of Riverside and the University of California Riverside, as well as the county. So what I noticed that each of those entities had different types of metrics and impacts and things they wanted to see impact. The university
Mm,
had one, county had another, city had another. Similar when I went to Lacey at the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, again, there they had support from the city, support from the Department of Water and Power, utility, and others. And again, for me, that's all about it. That goes back to this idea of diversity and inclusion. There's this diversity, the type of supporters that you have, and you're trying to be inclusive to utilize all to create this opportunity where you're providing impact for everybody else in that space. I think
right.
I think now we're seeing a lot of the public policies and state and local policies come into play to impact the work we're doing in the private sector. And I see cities like Atlanta, who has their own chief sustainability officer, Sandra Ferry, who's definitely been working on ways to think about ways to encourage businesses to come into the city that focus on sustainability, encourage the existing companies in the city to focus on sustainability, particularly in partnership with the clean image culture, the organization I spoke about earlier. And so I think that these opportunities, we're seeing more and more cities that are like that, that are realizing that you need to have this public-private approach to solving some of
Yeah.
these issues. Because everything just can't be solved by government. It has to be this piece of it. And then also too, from a company standpoint, companies have to get to know the communities. They have to know what's needed before they just create a product or a service to try to fulfill the need. I liken it to the story I once heard before about a lot of these computers that were going to villages in parts of Kenya and Africa. And there was this idea of fundraising and everything else in that, and the need was something totally different than what was provided. And so I think a lot of times when you think about public-private partnerships or working with cities, there's this bit of listening that needs to happen, both from the
Right.
entrepreneur, private capital going to the space, but also from the city going to the space. Those of us in the investment world, we often heard this phrase that policy follows innovation. So a lot of times we kind of step over it and we create it, and then policy has to catch up with us. But I think we're now in a space where policy and innovation are coming to a nexus where they're trying to work together to solve this issue, especially in the climate.
Yeah. Is there any specific advice you maybe give to somebody who, like Sandra, you spoke about? It's a very small world in the sustainability community. Because I actually, when I was interning with South back in the day, she was the program director there. So
Yeah.
to see her job as the chief sustainability officer for Atlanta, that was beautiful for her. It's a good big. So, are there any maybe just advice you could give to somebody who's either on the corporate side or on the city side, that to find each other and to work together?
Yeah, I mean, there are several organizations, and like I put one that's really great, and we've worked with them before. They're called CivStart, CIVSTART.org. It's an organization that deliver. That's what they do. They bring together the public community, the public municipalities, states, and what have you, with founders in this space. And so that gives the opportunity, because I think one of the things that's needed is to be able to communicate. And a lot of times, a lot of these organizations want to do the same thing, but they're just talking about it differently. Right? This idea of translation. And I look at organizations like CivStart as a translator for these things. I think also too, the same advice that we would give founders in venture capital is what I would give these organizations, people trying to walk into this space. Often I would tell founders that put yourself in a venture capitalist's shoes before you go pitch. Think about what motivates them. Think about what they have to do. Think about how they're looking at it, as opposed to saying, I'm gonna pitch, I'm gonna show this. And I think that that's a better way to look at that. And I think the same thing for founders who are looking to work with cities and other things. Looking at what's
Right.
driving them. What are some initiatives that the city or the municipality is trying to do that you could tie your product into, and really understand what are the metrics that they're trying to do, and coming
Right.
from a win. And a lot of times I often say when people think about relationships, I look at relationships like banking, right? And I think that we look at a relationship like a bank account. You have to make deposits into your bank account before you take withdrawals. If you don't
Right.
make deposits into those relationships, you'll have a non-sufficient funds. You have a negative account. And it's the same thing. In order to have true partnerships, you have to make deposits sometimes in those relationships before you even ask. And I think a lot of times with founders, we think, because again, I'm a former founder myself, I think a lot of times we may think that I don't have time to deposit. And I often say there are 96 15 minutes in a day. There's always
Mm.
time to make a deposit into a relationship, whether that's monetarily, whether they're even sharing something on social media, whether they're speaking to somebody's name who's not in the room. I've mentioned a number of different organizations here who some I'm affiliated with, some I'm not, but that's a way of paying it forward and making deposits in those relationships. And I think we think about it from that standpoint, and it's similar to what Techstars talks about with Give First, that we see a lot of, that I think is an important factor when you talk about companies who they want to work with these municipalities in these cities, and first, vice versa, cities who want to work with a lot of private capital, a lot of startups, and a lot of investors.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good way to look at things. 96, 15 minute dip. It gives you a little more perspective on how much you can really get done. I mean, if you only dedicated 15 minutes to something every day, eventually it's going to have to come to something, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
So, speaking of 15-minute increments, I know you've given me about 5 or 6 of your 15 minutes, and I really appreciate it. So, we
Yeah.
kind of wrap this up. I wanted to ask you, are there any specific messages you'd like to leave with our listeners, particularly those who are looking to make a difference in the world in the climate space?
Yeah. Well, first piece of advice is continue to listen to this podcast because you're having some great folks on it. So definitely
Thank you.
subscribe, all the whole things on it as well. One of the
Yes,
other
sir.
things I would say to you is sometimes listen to the outliers. One of my favorite authors is Malcolm Gladwell, and a lot of the
Mm,
books he's written I followed, and I love this idea of looking at the outsiders. But also when I think about music and I take it back to the music space of it, some of my favorite artists are those that have been one hit wonders.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean that their stuff doesn't jam. I think about artists like Das Effects. They had a song called
Wow.
Mic Check and all this other stuff, right?
Yeah.
And the impact is still felt today when we hear words from Snoop Dogg in this space.
Yep.
And so I say all that to say that a lot of times a lot of founders would say, especially in the climate space, I only want to talk to the partners of a venture fund. I only want to talk to successful founders. We want to talk to everyone. I mean,
Yep.
the ones who took an L, the founders who failed are just as important and impactful and have a lot of knowledge than the founders who succeeded, probably if not more, because you can learn from the pitfalls that you can go over, that you can avoid. I think further too, talking to people who are not in the climate space would help you really kind of get a tune to how you're articulating what you're building in the climate space. Because a lot of times, again, we get into these silos where you only hear this positive feedback from us. We need to get these contrarian ideas so we can understand how we can better position our product. Because at the end of the day, our service, because at the end of the day, it's about storytelling. And in order for you to tell a good story, you have to have this ingestion of all these other stories that come to you, so that way you can create something that has some meaning, that has value. And once you do that, the money will come.
Definitely. Absolutely. So where can our audience learn more about your work specifically, and how can they get involved in the initiatives that you're passionate about?
No, absolutely. No, I appreciate it. I think LinkedIn has been a great tool. They're partnering with us. So you definitely find me on LinkedIn under my full name, Taj Ahmad Eldridge. But one of the things I always say too is that, you know, a lot of times people may not be on LinkedIn, they may be on things like Indeed and other spaces. So I also look forward to seeing people on Instagram at Econoahmad, ECONOAHMAD 1911 there. Because I think, the conversation is great. And so definitely find me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter, find me on TikTok, find me on Spill, find me on Row, all on the Econoahmad, X as well, the old Twitter. But most importantly, man, I think for me, find me on the street. You'll see me, you'll see the hat. Come up and talk to
Yeah.
me. I'm always interested in learning more about the people I run into than people hearing
Mm.
from me. Because you can learn about the things I do on podcasts like this, but I want to hear from
Yes.
people on the street because those things inform the work that I do and inform the
Mm.
things that we do as well. You'll learn more about the work I either do with GFF from gff.org, or definitely follow Include Ventures at includeventures.com to see about the work we do in the venture capital side. So looking forward to seeing people out in the street as well.
All right. You guys will share his websites and his social media on the comments. So I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to meet in person soon as we travel around this world.
Absolutely.
Hope that my guests enjoyed this conversation as much as I did.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all.